Francesco Petrarca, the first Renaissance man. Francesco Petrarca, born in the late Middle Ages, discovered that something was wrong with the period in which he lived. He realized the great heritage of Greece and Rome had been neglected. Petrarch also found that a rot had creeped into the universities. Education had changed into a study of abstract and absurd theological arguments, while teaching next to nothing about how to lead good lives. He concluded that he was living in the Dark Ages, and then advocated for a rebirth or renaissance of the grandeur of Greece and Rome.
Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start.
Petrarch's parents came from Florence, which would later become the geographic center of the Italian Renaissance. But for political reasons, his father was expelled from the city, and as a result, Petrarch was born in exile in Arezzo. Not long after, his family moved even further from home, to Avignon. His father had found a job there in the large bureaucracy of the papacy, which had recently moved to Avignon under the pressure of the French king. And Petrarch, by the way, would later become a strong critic of the corruption of the papacy. Already during his early schooling, Petrarch discovered his love for pagan literature, especially for the works by the great Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero and the poet Virgil. Medieval thinkers from before his time would also read these same classics, but, quote, with no surrender to their charm, as one of the modern biographers of Petrarch calls it. These medieval scholars saw these works only as aids to their study of theology. Petrarch, instead, absorbed their very spirit, enjoying them for their own sake, which became one of the hallmarks of the Renaissance. Later in his life, he wrote about this: I have read Virgil, Horace, Boethius, and Cicero. I read them not once, but 1,000 times. I brooded over them with every effort of my intelligence. I have ingested them in such an intimate way that they have become fixed, not only in my memory, but in my marrow. The result is that they have taken deep root in the deepest part of my spirit. Well, that is a way to truly absorb a text. One of the classical authors that Petrarch read over and over again was the Roman historian Livy, who had written a history of Rome. Reading his work, Petrarch came to see Rome as a better world. And as a result, he became disappointed with his own age, especially by its neglect of the great works of the past. Many important manuscripts by the great ancient writers had been lost or were corrupted by careless errors and revisions by medieval scribes. In a fictitious letter he wrote to Livy, we now know that you wrote 142 books on Roman matters. You must have worked with such energy and such unremitting zeal. Now, of that entire number, barely 30 exist. Later generations who, not satisfied with their own disgraceful barrenness, permitted the writings that their ancestors had produced by toil and application to perish through insufferable neglect. Although they had nothing of their own to hand down to those who were to come after, they robbed posterity, that is the future generations, of its ancestral heritage. Very strong words indeed. The Roman works that did exist in Petrarch's time were often incomplete and filled with errors. To remedy this problem, Petrarch set out to compare different versions of the classical texts in order to try to return them to their original state. And this also became one of the characteristic endeavors of the Renaissance. In his teenage years, Petrarch studied law, following the advice of his father, first in Montpellier and later in Bologna, the famous law school of the Middle Ages. But after his father passed away, he quickly dropped out of school. And from that moment on, he operated from outside the institutions, In fact, he would become openly anti-institutional. And he wouldn't be the only Renaissance figure to do so either. Petrarch initially became famous for his love poetry, written about a woman named Laura. He saw Laura while attending church in Avignon. Although they did not even speak with each other, she became his lifelong obsession. She became the subject of most of his poems, which he wrote in Italian instead of Latin. And these poems became so popular that in later centuries, they were used to standardize the still underdeveloped Italian language. Unfortunately, we know very little about Laura. She is described in his poetry as beautiful, virtuous, and intelligent, with blonde ringlets, dark eyes, and a pleasing voice. Some verses indicate that she was married, which might explain why Petrarch did not pursue her further. We also read that Petrarch carried a portrait of her everywhere he went, made by the famous artist Simone Martini. In his personal notes, written in the flyleaf of a book he wrote with his father, we read that she died about 20 years after they first met. It reads, "Laura, celebrated for her virtue and long made famous in my poems, first appeared before my eyes in the early years of my young manhood, in the year of our Lord, 1327, on the 6th day of April, in the church of Saint Clare in Avignon, in the same city, in the same month, on the same 6th day, at the same first hour, in the year 1348, that light was taken from our day. I decided to write down the harsh memory of this painful loss, and I did so with a certain bitter sweetness, in this very place that so often passes before my eyes, that is, that book, that it might remind me that there is nothing in this life in which I can any more find pleasure, and that it is time now that the strongest link to this place has been broken, to flee from Babylon," which is a pejorative term for Avignon, referring to the corruption of the papacy. In his later years, he wrote in his short autobiography, quote, "In my younger days, I struggled constantly with an overwhelming but pure love affair, my only one, and I would have struggled with it longer had not premature death, bitter but salutary for me, extinguished the cooling flames." Due to the relation between the words Laura and Laurel or Lauro, the laurel tree features often in his poems. Coincidentally, in Roman times, victorious generals and distinguished poets would also be crowned with the laurel wreath. It became Petrarch's goal to receive the same honor, which eventually actually happened. He became the first person since Roman times to receive the laurel wreath by a Roman senator, and his coronation took place on Capitol Hill in Rome. Petrarch famously reflected on his feelings for Laura in his work titled On the Secret Conflicts of My Cares, also known as The Secret. The title refers to Petrarch's intention to keep this book private, but it was finally published after his death. The work starts with, "So, little book, I bid you to flee from the places of men and be content to stay with me, true to the title I have given you. For you are my secret, and thus you are titled. And when I would think upon deep matters, speak to me in secret about what has been in secret spoken to you." Writing and reading this work helped Petrarch to sort out his most private thoughts and feelings, which he claimed had a healing effect on him. With this, Petrarch showed an unprecedented interest in both the intimate, subjective world of man and also in the human condition itself, both central characteristics of the Renaissance. In The Secret, Petrarch reveals the many contradictions of a man who was still standing with one foot in the Middle Ages and with the other in the Renaissance. On the one hand, he parroted the Christian notion that life is just a brief preparation for the afterlife. Yet he was at the same time obsessed with his earthly achievements and his earthly love. The text is written as a dialogue between Petrarch and St. Augustine, the 4th century church father. Petrarch allowed the character Augustine to expose his flaws, especially his unchristian feelings of lust and pride. His feelings of lust were of course related to Laura. Being still caught up in medieval church doctrine, Petrarch had a hard time to come to terms with the feelings of love and desire, and Augustine constantly warned him of the corrupting nature of lust. But then the modern Petrarch breaks through. He could not bring himself to believe that his love for Laura would obstruct his path to salvation. In fact, he believed that love ennobled him. But Augustine then disagreed, reminding him he should not hold Laura in higher esteem than God. Augustine pointed out, "Your eyes are always wet and besieged by concern, a mind that is jumbled and sleep robbed of rest. Do these seem to be the signs of good health to you?" Finally, Petrarch gave in, agreeing that his inner turmoil and depression had indeed started when he first laid eyes on her. Petrarch also couldn't shake off his feelings of pride. Petrarch was very conscious of his public identity and believed he was destined to be remembered throughout the ages as his Roman heroes were. This had also been one of his motivations behind receiving that laurel crown. In an attempt to be a good Christian, he often claimed to be modest and humble, yet in reality he often displayed an unusual amount of self-obsessed arrogance. This can be seen, for instance, in the title of his short autobiography, Letter to Posterity, written for his future readership in generations to come. In some cases, his arrogance was truly over the top. In his work Africa, he lets the Greek poet Homer foretell the coming of a great poet named Franciscus from Florence, wearing a laurel crown, who will, quote, restore the ancient sisters, that is the Muses, to Helicon, the home of the Muses. That is, he saw himself as a pivotal character in world history. And to be fair, he was, but it's still a bit arrogant. In response, Augustine constantly reminded Petrarch of the brevity of life and the certainty of death, which made a mockery of all these earthly ambitions. Even books and graves, he claimed, will eventually be forgotten. Augustine advised Petrarch to put aside his literary work and to focus instead on his salvation. And once more, Petrarch eventually agreed with Augustine on an intellectual level, but he remained unwilling to leave his work behind. The modern man in Petrarch could not be totally extinguished by medieval Christian ideals. Now let's discuss Petrarch's favorite classical hero, the philosopher and statesman Cicero. Petrarch admired Cicero as the ultimate model of Latin eloquence. Amazed by the beautiful style of Cicero's Latin, Petrarch began to notice how much the language had decayed in the hands of medieval scholars. In comparison, medieval Latin seemed ugly, uninspiring, and unclear. In an attempt to rediscover lost Roman texts, Petrarch made trips to obscure libraries across Europe. This search also became a hallmark of the Renaissance. And then, in 1333, while searching in an old Belgian library, he discovered one of Cicero's orations, named Pro Archia. In this work, Cicero defended the poet Archias in court. And in 1345, he made an even more significant discovery, this time in Verona, Italy. He found Cicero's personal letters to his close friend Atticus, to the politician Brutus, and to his brother Quintin. These letters are still regarded as a reliable source for the period just before the fall of the Roman Republic. They are very important texts. The letters also gave a candid view into Cicero's personality, bringing the Roman world to life in an unprecedented and intimate way. The discovery was so monumental that it is often identified as the starting point of the Renaissance. In order to further develop this intimate connection with the past, Petrarch began to write mock letters to his long-dead heroes. Instead of using a formulaic formal style, he wrote them as one friend to another, a real attempt to make that connection to Greece and Rome. About this practice he wrote, "Ignoring the space of time which separates us, I addressed him," that is Cicero, "with a familiarity springing from my sympathy with his genius." His letter to Cicero starts with, "Francesco to Cicero, greetings. Having found your letters where I least expected them to, after searching long and hard, I read them avidly. I heard you discussing many things, bewailing many things, changing your mind about many things. Marcus Tullius Cicero, and you, who I had before known as a teacher of others, I now, at last, have come to know yourself. What a beautiful quote. But then, instead of praising Cicero, which he did do on many other occasions, he immediately focused on his many mistakes. Quote, "Now it is your turn to be the listener. Listen wherever you are to the words of advice, or rather of sorrow and regret, that fall not unaccompanied by tears from the lips of one of your successors, who loves you faithfully and cherishes your name. What good could you think would come from your incessant wrangling, from all this wasteful strife and enmity?" Referring to the political intrigues he was involved in during the end of the Roman Republic. And we continue, "The wise counsel that you gave your brother and the salutary advice of your great masters you forgot. Why were you so friendly with Augustus? What answer can you give Brutus? You began to speak ill of the very friend you had so lauded, although he was not doing any ill to you, but merely refusing to prevent others who were. I grieve, dear friend, at such fickleness. These shortcomings fill me with pity and shame. And although these were criticisms, you can see Petrarca having an honest, real emotional connection with the past here. In his second letter to Cicero, Petrarca spoke about his first trip to Rome in 1337. He was deeply impressed by what he saw. We read, "Rome was, in truth, even greater than I had thought, and the ruins even greater still. I wonder no longer why the world was dominated by this city, but rather why I was dominated by it so late." Yet in his day, Petrarca claimed, Rome had turned into a ruined medieval city, afflicted by clan rivalries and lawlessness. To Cicero he wrote, "You will wish me to tell you something about the condition of Rome and the Roman Republic. Trust me, Cicero, if you were to hear of our condition today, you would be moved to tears, in whatever circle of heaven above or Erebus below you may be dwelling." Based on these observations, Petrarca came to believe that the world had entered a period of darkness after the fall of Rome. He wrote that the men of genius of his own day were surrounded by darkness. We read, "Amidst the errors there shone forth men of genius. No less keen were their eyes, although they were surrounded by darkness and dense gloom." He even went as far as to claim that his own age repelled him. Quote, "Among the many subjects which have interested me, I have dwelt especially upon antiquity, for our own age has always repelled me, so that had it not been for the love of those dear to me, I should have preferred to have been born in any other period than our own." When asked why he didn't include the lives of contemporary figures in his work on illustrious men, about the lives of exemplary figures, he answered, quote, "They offer material suitable not so much for history, but rather for satire. I do not wish for the sake of so few famous names to guide my pen so far and through such darkness." Again, a very damning statement. Where medieval historians usually saw their own era as a continuation of the Roman Empire, be it in a different form, Petrarca saw a definite break. The golden age of ancient Greece and Rome, which he described as an age of light, had made way for a period of decline characterized as an age of darkness. Only on some occasions was Petrarca hopeful for a better future. He wrote, "Who can doubt that, were Rome to know itself once more, that it would rise again?" This hope even got him to support various politicians and even tyrants, who he believed capable of restoring Rome to its former glory. And in Africa he wrote about these hopes, "There will follow a better age. This sleep of forgetfulness will not last forever. When the darkness has been dispersed, Our descendants can come again in the former pure radiance. We also find this idea in a famous quote by Petrarca that Machiavelli would later use to end his work, The Prince. We read, "Virtue will take up arms against rage, and the fighting will be short, since the ancient strength in Italian hearts is not yet dead." In one case, Petrarca got very close to naming his own age the Middle Ages. He wrote, "There was a more fortunate age, and probably there will be one again. In the middle, in our time, you see the confluence of misery and disgrace." And this is where that idea of a Middle Ages comes from. About a century later, Leonardo Bruni was finally confident enough to announce that that third period had begun. He was the first to divide history in antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern world. In the 20th century, many historians have asked whether Petrarch's assessment of the Middle Ages was fair. For instance, a case can be made that the 12th century, the height of the Middle Ages, was also a time of great development, arguably even more so than the early Renaissance. The 12th century saw, among other things, the revival of Roman law, the founding of universities and Gothic architecture. The 12th century also saw a substantial translation movement, with the goal of translating the classics, such as the works of Aristotle, back into Latin. And the 12th century also saw an unprecedented interest in science, even more so than in the Renaissance. This does not sound like an age of darkness. So does Petrarch's conception of the Dark Ages actually hold? In my estimation, much of his critique remains valid. Medieval thinkers generally saw life as a preparation for the afterlife, while the Renaissance instead brought back a world more focused on this life, on human nature and human flourishing, instead of abstract and often nonsensical theology. The Renaissance, in short, restored our humanity. Finally, we'll discuss Petrarch's critique on the university culture of his day. According to Petrarch, the medieval philosophers had turned education into the study of abstract and irrelevant theological arguments, far removed from the Christianity described in the New Testament. And to make matters worse, these theologists had done next to nothing to help people lead good lives. Petrarch's critique on academia, including the study of theology, was worked out most extensively in his invective on his own ignorance and that of many others. The book tells of his conversations with 4 aristocrats in Venice. We read, "They know about wild beasts, birds and fish, how many hairs a lion has in his mane, how many feathers a hawk has in its tail, the intelligence of animals and its resemblance to humankind. They tell how the phoenix lives 2 or 3 centuries, and is then consumed by an aromatic fire to be born again from its ashes. In most cases, these things are false, as was revealed when many such animals were brought to our part of the world. Clearly, the facts were not known to those reporting them, and they were more readily believed or more freely invented because the animals were not present. Yet even if they were true, they would contribute absolutely nothing to the happiness of our life. What use is it, I ask, to know the nature of beasts and birds and fish and snakes, and to ignore or neglect our human nature? The purpose of our birth, and whence we come and whither we are bound." So Petrarch here placed natural science below the humanities. He writes, "It is a better thing to will the good than to know the truth." And this, in my opinion, might be the reason for the relatively low scientific activity during the Renaissance. There was much more science going on in the 12th century, and of course way more in the Age of Enlightenment, Newton's age. When Petrarch read a scientific text, he claimed that he learned facts, but these facts did not improve him as a human being. He wrote, "My spirit was what it had been before. My will was the same. I was the same." This anti-scientific attitude can perhaps be explained by the fact that Petrarch could not read Greek. The Greeks were very interested in the abstract, while the Romans were more practically minded, And this might explain why the Renaissance was mostly a return to Rome, and not so much to the abstract thinking of the Greeks, who wrote about abstract philosophy, physics, and mathematics. The main philosopher studied at university in Petrarch's time was the Greek philosopher Aristotle. His authority carried such respect that many academics dogmatically accepted whatever he had written. Petrarch, in contrast, wanted more ancient voices to be heard and also wanted people to think for themselves. He wrote, "Aristotle was a great man and a polymath, but he was still human and could therefore have been ignorant of some things or even many things. I do not worship Aristotle." Petrarch saw the classics as fundamentally human products and therefore also subject to error and in need of critical analysis. Whenever Petrarch contradicted Aristotle, the academics would protest. We read, "At first they were amazed by what I had to say, and then angered, for they felt that my words ran counter to their sect," that is, the sect of Aristotle and its ancestral laws. These friends of ours are so captivated by their love and mere name of Aristotle that they call it a sacrilege to pronounce any opinion that differs from his on any matter. Hence, as the greatest proof of my ignorance, they cite some remark that I made about virtue that was insufficiently Aristotelian. "Behold, a crime worthy of the death penalty," he jokes. "That doesn't mean that I spoke wrongly, for I was, quote, not bound to swear by the words of any master, as Horace, a Roman poet, says of himself." They would look at me as a blasphemer for requiring more than that man's authority as proof of fact. It was clear that, from philosophers and eager lovers of wisdom, they had become Aristotelians, who were allowed to ask after nothing unless he said it. And this was also why Petrarch didn't hesitate to criticize even his own hero Cicero. He was not, quote, so blinded by the love of his hero Cicero and by the brightness of his name that he preferred to praise him even when he was in the wrong. Instead, he embraced his faults and virtues together. An important new shift that was also emblematic of the Renaissance. He continued, "My critique does not alter the fact that the beauty of this work delights me still, beyond that of many other writers. Cicero himself, the very man of whom we are speaking, also took this view, for he often bewailed his own errors bitterly. Instead of relying on the authority of others, Petrarch boldly claimed, 'I am my own authority.' And this new self-confidence, to be able to think for oneself, also became one of the key aspects of the Renaissance. And thus unfolded the world-changing ideas of Petrarch, the first Renaissance man. Thank you for watching. If you want to know more about the Renaissance or many other topics from world history, read my book, In Search of the Sublime. You can buy it on Amazon or you can read it for free on worldhistorybook.com. See you next time. Bye bye.